Hey, sorry, I wasn't realizing that we were meeting on video. I thought we were meeting in virtual reality. I thought this was gonna be a blended conversation. I thought we were gonna be meeting hybrid. Are we all remote today? I don't know about you, but the world has been, and the way that we gather has kind of been put into a blender. And if I put strawberries and bananas and blueberries into a blender, I'm never getting those strawberries, blueberries, and bananas back in their original form. The world is hybrid. Just in case you were wondering, virtual is never going to go away completely. There will always be a degree of remote work. You'll always be meeting with somebody who's not there in person, right? No matter what's happening with COVID, this is the way that work has changed. That's my 2 cents. The rest of this video is to offer you my thoughts on best practices for hybrid rooted in my specific experience, not just my ideas. I'm gonna share with you 3 categories of hybrid that I think we need to have in our mind and consider. And then I'm gonna share 5 specific clients that represent 5 different types of hybrid and the lessons that I learned from them. So you'll get some real world examples, practice, of how hybrid can work really well and how it might not, so that you can make it work for yourself. Let's get into it. Look down real quick at the title of this video. Notice the last 2 words in parentheses titled "so far." One of my teachers and mentors and friends, Eric Tyler, wrote a book called The Best Advice So Far. It's a really excellent book, has nothing to do with hybrid meetings, but the idea of so far, right? This is my current best thinking on hybrid, subject to change. In fact, I'd love for you to change my thinking. I'd love to understand a little bit more about what you're experiencing. So as this video goes on, as I share these examples with my current and past clients working in different hybrid arrangements, can you drop a comment below with one thing that you learned about how to do hybrid really well? And in theory, the longer this video lives on the internet, the more useful the comments thread will actually get. Thanks for doing that. Now here's my grains of salt. Grains of salt?
2 cents of salt?
2 cents. So here's a couple grains of salt. The first one is 3 categories of hybrid that should probably have their own separate video, but they don't for right now. We got teach, meet, and collaborate. So in an online learning context, there are a whole bunch of things you want to consider in a hybrid environment. In a meeting context, there are a whole bunch of things, right? You always had to reserve a room maybe to meet in or designate what room. We used to only have to designate a link. Now we have to do both. Right? And then collaborate, the third category is, you might be an intact team, group that's worked together for a while. You need to get together and work deeply. It would be really convenient if you were all in the same space. You could do sticky notes and whiteboard and all that kind of stuff. But you're in any variation, right? Either Gemma is on her on the laptop at the end of the table, or you might be in a $250,000 Cisco telepresence system in the room that makes you feel like you're there, right? Any arrangement of hybrid, the point is there's some pixelated people and some not pixelated people, but you want to feel as if you're in the same space, able to interact and move hands and exchange things as easily as possible. So before I share these 5 examples, I would encourage you to choose one of these buckets to consider, to ruthlessly reinterpret and imagine, do I want to listen with the teaching mindset, or the teaching category of hybrid? Do I want to listen with the meeting context and listen for tips and ideas there? Or do I want to listen for the collaborative context? First client, WSU Tech, amazing school, some really cool technical programs to get people from high school or GED or non-degree into well-paying job. Sometimes some of their programs are within 6 weeks. They're making sheet metals for airlines, etc. I started working with them remotely. I had 6 sessions with faculty on how to make virtual engagement easy, and we tagged on 1 final in-person session. They were having a big faculty development summit, and so got to go to Wichita, and my learning here is that when you start remote, like some people are hesitant about starting to onboard someone before they can actually show up. I would say don't be. It is so cool to have met somebody, and this is gonna happen more and more as time goes on, but it's so cool to have met somebody or met the top 18% of somebody on Zoom, and then to see them in person and be like, ooh, you have legs, that's cool. In fact, I probably had a dozen faculty come in and be like, Nice shoes, didn't know you wore any, right? Or some comment related to that. So it actually created this high. It was like, it was a very connecting thing. And some people even had the response when they saw me in person, like, wow, like you look so real, or HD, or whatever. It was this really magical moment. And so the point is, don't be afraid of starting all remote or being all remote at any given time. And in fact, I'll rip the Band-Aid off now. I'm gonna share with you details about each one of my clients, but the most difficult version of hybrid is when half the group is in person and half the group is not. Sharing about WSU Tech was kind of a high note, how hybrid can work really well and create moments of connection. On the flip side, I worked for an organization called ERT, and this was long before COVID. Globally distributed team that exists to make sure that clinical trials are safe. And in working with them, I had half the group in a conference room in Philadelphia and half the group spread out all over on a big screen in my room. And I was in person with the group. This was long before we had the experience of working remotely or hybrid, and oh my goodness, that form of delivery was really tough. Now some teachers during COVID had done that for day after day, right? A hybrid where they're teaching in the classroom and they got half the class there, half the class on Zoom. And I'll just rip the Band-Aid off. In my opinion, having done just about every possible variation of hybrid, that is the worst one. Having half and half. And so my lesson there is avoid it if possible. Meaning all remote is actually better than half in person and half distributed in separate locations. Now, it would be one thing if you have 5 people in one conference room in New York and 5 people in another conference room in California. That actually can go a little bit better because it's almost like a Zoom call between 2 people. And so there's less chaos and management and distraction, etc. When you have people who share context and people who don't, it creates a lot of separation. I'm sure there are some creative, clever ways around that. My best tip right now, though, is move things to avoid it. Have people join Zoom from the office and then go chat with people afterward, because I believe that meaningful connection and good conversation can actually happen better when everybody is in the same boat, in the same context. Now, we don't live in an ideal world, so lesson number 2 from working with ERT is train everybody up in tech. Being able to set up your conference system is not the IT guy's job anymore. It is everyone's job. If we want to communicate with each other, we have to learn to speak the language of technology. And if that's really frustrating and annoying, I get it. And if you don't learn to speak Spanish, you can't speak to people who speak Spanish. All right, I'll flip-flop between positive notes and tough notes about hybrid. Positive note, I worked with Indiana University, IU, in Bloomington. And I worked with their whole career achievement center and all their staff there. I had worked with them in person before, then continued work remotely where they were all in the same room and I was broadcasted on a big screen. So my head was very big, so I needed to make sure I went down to my wife afterward and asked her to pop that ego, because I literally had a very big head in that moment. And this happened recently with North Dakota State University, and maybe we can toss up a screenshot here if I remember to put it in the file of that happening so you can see that happening. Here's my note on that. Having a speaker, presenter, somebody come in remotely, present to everybody, can work really, really great. Brilliantly, actually. Almost to the point that it's just as fantastic as all being together in the same context, with a couple caveats. I'm actually doing it again for a 500-person conference for 4-H in Wisconsin. So there's gonna be 500 people chaotically in person, some other folks virtually. I'm doing a kickoff keynote remotely, and then 2 breakouts, one specifically for only the virtual attendees, and one specifically for only the in-person attendees. Do you see how I'm getting context there? If you could rewind and hear the plane noise that me and Steven just heard. This method of hybrid prevents you from getting on a plane, right? It saves my fees for coming in and being with a group, facilitating a conference, kicking off with a keynote remote are not the same as traveling in person, right? I have to spend sleeps away from my son. There's all this travel involved, logistics, jet fuel, lots of other stuff involved in getting somebody there. And so what's cool about this is it can give you access to speakers that otherwise you may not be able to afford to bring into your conference, and the experience can still be fantastic. Now, I would field test, make sure their virtual setup is really dynamite, right? You don't want somebody joining from a webcam on their laptop giving a keynote to 500 people, because that's gonna just feel like a clunky call with your great grandmother that's still learning FaceTime. Love you, Meme. The other quick note there is the hardest thing with that format, for me as somebody who wants to constantly interact with my audience and hear from them, I don't want to just be a sage, instead of a sage on the stage, I guess a sage on the screen. I haven't thought of that until this moment, but that makes a lot of sense. So instead of being a sage on the screen, right, I want to interact. And so the key there is making sure that there's somebody on site that can set up a good mic system. And there are a couple ways to do that. Culturally, I set it up to make sure there's some high quality mics that are positioned in a room, and maybe we put a masking tape box and people can run into those boxes anytime they want to say something to me. And I might set the culture that at any point in time, you can run into that box, and if I see somebody on my camera run into that box, I'll pause, we'll take a little commercial break for you, and we'll have that dialogue back and forth. Or for Q&A or for anything else, having that space is really useful, because having somebody scream something out from the back of the room, or just popcorning as I normally would in person or when we're all remote, doesn't quite work the same. Bouncing out of a university context, work with a fair amount of fast growth tech companies. One in particular designed for developers to be this platform to build really phenomenal fast websites. All remote team spread out all over the globe. I first worked with them facilitating an executive leadership retreat in New York City. We were all together in the same space, and our intention was to come up with vision, mission, values, some cultural norms. And my lesson from working with them, because after we all left New York City, I continued to work with their team in an all remote capacity. And so had an all staff session that I facilitated to create some connection before content and roll out some of these norms and create an experience around what we had created and come up with, which included the voice of everybody, by the way. Don't mistake a bunch of leaders meeting in a room in New York City as we just got together and decided all the values for everybody else, right? We took a lot of data from other people before we got together and made some choices around language. Anyway, to make a long story longer, it became very clear how important those communication norms and values were, because it became the way in which you gave feedback to people across time zone. When you're using asynchronous communication, so somebody drops a Slack message to somebody else that reads it 3 hours later, all sorts of miscommunications can happen. And so to be able to set the culture of how you want to communicate, what times you want to communicate, when things need to escalate to a phone call or a video call, when they should just remain a message, when it should be an email, all of that in very fine detail needs to be discussed and worked out. And you don't have to. I know that's time consuming to work that out in detail, and you don't have to, but you'll just deal with miscommunication after miscommunication after miscommunication in a group. And so it is, in my opinion, in my 2 grains of salt, my 2 cents of salt, well worth taking a few hours out of people's regular run of the day to decide on some of those norms. If you want to watch the video on how to manage up, I talk about creating a user guide. That also could be really, really helpful as well. So one note, not specifically related to Vercel, but just working with many globally distributed teams. Time zones are a major barrier to communication. And so some companies that I've worked with got to the point where they realized there are some time zones that we just can't hire people in because it is so bad for culture and communication. Not because of their culture, but because of the times that they're working, the times they're awake, etc. And so a lot of groups that I've worked with have scaled back and said, hey, we need to localize teams, or we need to have this team only doing this in these time zones, etc. So make sure you get specific about that. Don't think that just because you can send everybody a Zoom link, that everybody's going to want to have an energized conversation about values or the next product launch at 3 in the morning. To end on a really positive note, used to work with World in Conversation. If you are subscribed to the channel, you probably heard me talk about my work with them, helping lead dialogues that transform conflict into collaboration. So we'd be having really contentious dialogues, and my role there for a while was as the global dialogues coordinator. So I got people in the US, paired up, mostly civilians, sometimes military cadets, paired up with civilians and military cadets in really stereotypically peaceful nations like Iraq, Iran, Gaza, Afghanistan, Pakistan, etc., for 90 minutes with the sole intention of skipping headlines and really understanding the other. And here's my final lesson on hybrid, meeting remotely, having half a group in person sitting with me and half a group halfway across the world sitting. My lesson is that with hybrid, with remote, with in person, real, true, and very meaningful connection is absolutely possible. And if you want somebody to help make this blended world of hybrid, in person, teaching, meeting, collaborating a little bit easier, drop me a line. I'd love to help out. My info is probably below. I'm Chad Littlefield. Have an awesome blended day.